doing is Patrick and I have prepared a couple of brief introductions of ourselves to share with all of you. And so I'll go ahead and share that without any further ado. So I'm happy to go first. I'm Anika, as the lovely introduction stated, and I've done a lot of different things at this intersection of online communities and journalism and technology. I've been a product manager, which is what I do now. I've been the author of a book, and I've been a journalist as well as a consultant to news organizations looking to do community-centered work. In addition, continue to stay involved in the world of journalism because I work on the board of a nonprofit called Hacks Hackers that works with journalists around the world. So excited to kind of bring all of those experiences as a technologist, a journalist, and now, a global somebody who works with a global nonprofit to this conversation. And then, of course, as Ness mentioned, one of the key things that I did that I think is relevant for this conversation is several years ago now, which is crazy to think. I wrote a book called How to Handle a Crowd. And this was a study of the lives of online moderators and really a deep dive into volunteer moderation, a space that fascinates me, continues to fascinate me, and that I'm excited and honored to be part of. And this followed on some research I had done earlier, really looking at the evolution of comment moderation and audience engagement in news organizations. So been really excited to delve into that and really understand what makes an amazing online community work. What are some of the challenges that moderators face? How does that overlap with journalism? And hoping to dig into a lot of that here today.
Thank you. And yeah, also for me, it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, especially because I was just telling that's just before this call, there is this realization that is really spreading across the world of journalism, that what community moderators have been exposed to and have had to deal with, and the insights they have gained and the work they do, is really coming to define what journalism is at large. And the learnings that we have from community moderators are so valuable for all media organizations. So I'm really happy to have this conversation. And I'm saying this as a journalist by training. I've started in Asia and been a reporter in Hong Kong and China, in Burma and Malaysia, and then in Europe, and a media executive later for larger media organizations that dealt with countries where there were some restrictions on the press, and so largely with exile media organizations, and including Iran, Russia, and China again. And I now consult and advise these organizations a bit here from out of New York City on how to reach and engage their communities in the countries where they are meant to operate but can't because of the political situation. And what I'm mostly thinking about in this space is really challenges around what do you do when there are outside factors like governments, like oligarchs, what have you, and they really subvert the public debate and make it incredibly challenging to have a healthy public debate. A lot of the social media platforms and commenting platforms are really built for free societies where you have where there are no such controls. And what you're seeing right now is not only that the systems we have built for, say, the United States or Europe or Australia sometimes can be weaponized, used against the civic society in countries with autocratic regimes. And you can also see that trickling through the diasporas into free societies. So really looking forward to this conversation. And maybe I can start with a question for Anika, in the sense that when you look at the social media space right now, we're seeing a lot of fragmentation. Twitter has changed fundamentally it's X now. There's threads, there's Discord servers. It's just such a changed environment from a couple of years ago. How do you look to, like, what does this tell you in terms of like community moderation, and where do you see, elements that give you hope that there are ways to make this better, to create kinder spaces?
Yeah. I think that's such a good question, Patrick. And I guess I'll answer it sort of in some ways, a 30,000-foot perspective. And I'm curious what you think as well. To me, it feels like these two spaces we're talking about, comment moderation and journalism, have been two fields that have had to adapt immensely over the past, like, 2 decades. I mean, I graduated from journalism school in 2008, which is a while ago now. And since then, it's really been a time of constant adaptation. And that adaptation has now collided when we think about conversation and participation online, because so much of what happens requires the work of moderators and is also influenced and affected by the work of journalists. So kind of to answer your question about the fragmentation more directly, like absolutely. And I think that's a trend that for me, at least, I've been seeing since I started out in both of these spaces, looking at online communities. We've been seeing more platforms, we've been seeing more audiences, we've been seeing more ways to reach people, but also more ways for people to kind of be in secret communities with, both negative and positive consequences. And so I think really a lot of the adaptation that I've seen, on the part, I guess I'll start by saying on the part of journalists to that fragmented environment, has been understanding how to find and reach in an authentic way audiences in new spaces, and having different types of conversations. And then for moderators, it's really understanding, and this is very related to the journalism concern, how you define your space and continue to create a culture within it that kind of promotes those values and keeps the corner of discussion or the corner of the internet that you're in, the kind of place that is true to your values. And so I think those are kind of really related questions. And I think that fragmentation makes both of these questions of like trust and relationship building potentially more challenging. That's what I've seen anyway. That's been my experience. But I'm curious how you'd answer the same question.
I would answer it exactly on like you did, on the point of increasingly closed spaces, just seeing that there are more and more spaces where this is no longer a public debate, but it's a group debate, say WhatsApp channels, what have you, where it's not as easily accessible to outsiders. And I'm just wondering, what are the social implications over time? Does that lead to greater polarization? Does it lead to, and how are we going to address it? Like one of the issues we wanted to talk about is really truth, right? I think we put it as post-truth. How do you handle post-truth when you don't have these public spaces? And I'm just wondering, what can be the interventions if the spaces are increasingly closed online? What can be the valuable interventions and contributions that journalists can make in such an environment of really closed communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I'm curious, like, I don't know if there's definitely no one right answer to this. I think different news organizations have kind of carved off different sections of it for themselves. Like when I was first studying, like, and I was telling you this yesterday, audience engagement at news organizations, many news organizations were in the midst of shutting down comment sections. This was a few years ago. I think and so that was like, we definitely realized that there were big challenges with the big general news comment section as a way to engage with meaningful discussion. But I think the idea of like what is a perfect model is still very open. And I think it's not just truth that we're kind of post-truth, we're also post-traditional authority. And I think that's sort of, I think a lot of organizations that are used to relying on institutional authority don't necessarily have that authority in the same way. And I guess what I would add to that, though, is that I think it's really interesting because one of the ideas that I came across in grad school when I was initially doing that research around online communities is this idea that we've always had kind of a multitude of discourses happening, but just that they weren't all visible. Or maybe we had one kind of dominant discourse, and that was sort of what people thought of as the only one that existed. And so a lot of people are like, oh, we're very, I mean, certainly polarization in society is going up for sure. But I think there's also a greater visibility and more space for alternative discourses, challenges to mainstream narratives. And I think that that's all contributing to this challenge around truth. And some of those challenges, I would argue, are very positive. They allow, opportunities for voices to be heard in public discussion that need to be. And then there's also obviously there's the challenge, right? Anytime you have this visible fragmentation, you have all different kinds of ideas, views, and communities coming into existence. Um, so yeah, I yeah, I see in the comments someone noted that's always sad to see comment sections being closed. Well, let me tell you, I have a whole series of thoughts around that. But yeah, at the time it was. And I don't know that we found an amazing secondary, follow on to that. I'm
I,
curious, Patrick, in your own experience too, kind of working around the world, if you've seen examples of engagement that you'd really pull out as either really, to the extent you can even talk about it, but like, really positive or really fractious from the perspective of journalistic organizations, especially in these kind of unfriendly or challenging environments.
the challenge is really that you build systems with intentions of enabling a civic discourse that is open and it's then relatively easy. These online communities are incredibly fragile, and it's easy to disrupt them. So I'll give you a couple of examples, perhaps, of how easily these things can break that we have built, and perhaps then a couple of examples of that give me hope. I was the target of, so I was a reporter in Hong Kong. There is this concept in China where you had the Wu Mao group of online moderators, and they will be paid 5 Mao, which is the subcurrency of the yuan, per online post that would support the Communist Party or denigrate anyone who's perceived to be a critic of the Communist Party, which included me at the time because I reported on on that, and it was impossible to have a conversation in the comments on any of my reporting because they got immediately flooded with people who were paid to stifle that debate. Another example we encountered in one of my previous roles in a country, in a Central Asian country, I'm going to say this, is that in that country, an oligarch, a very influential person with ties to the government, actually used a prison and it turned its inmates into trolls. So all the prisoners had no choice because they're imprisoned, but for hours every day to post comments that are favorable for this oligarch and critical of journalists in that country. And you see the challenges that you face here, because if you have, our systems have improved so significantly to spot inauthentic behavior. So, but these are real people. And what do you do in such situations when real people are moved to kind of disrupt conversations as fragile things? And one place that I look to always with some hope is Taiwan. Mentioned it yesterday in the presentation. There are really interesting asynchronous deliberative processes, even for policy, for government policy, that are built in a way like Reddit is built. And that's really, really interesting, and how that allows people to express themselves. I'm someone who's really awkward in a crowd of real people. I love these online sessions because they become equalizing settings really for everyone. And so I think there's a lot that we can do around that if we're intentional. And the other point in terms of the fragmentation, I love your point on the main, like that we had this illusion that there was just like one mainstream kind of society, and news organizations lived around that, and others existed, they were just not seen. And right now our learning curve, I believe, as journalists, is really to earn our stripes, earn our right to speak in these communities, with these communities. I'd be also curious if you have seen any examples that inspire you or give you hope.
Yes. I mean, so what I would say is, I guess I think that's a really good point. And I really appreciate your point about Taiwan, actually. I made a note to myself to kind of do more research. But I think there are two areas in which I think about what you've said. The first is being effective as a moderator, and the other is being effective as a government. And I think, like, in order to be effective as a government, you have to solve a much more complex series of questions, because you're trying to, and what I mean by that is you're trying to manage a nation of real people. You're often making very huge decisions. You need certain, you often value certain types of equality, inclusiveness, and participation. And so there are these, like, I think the challenge of creating, like, using online discussion at the government level is influenced a lot by things like, what languages do people use? How accessible is technology in your particular, like, within your particular structure, within your particular polity? And so that really becomes a challenge. Like, I think it's really hard to take those democratic principles and apply them to an online space. And there are lots of people doing great work around that. And I think that's interesting. I think the question of a moderator, though, to me is a little bit different, in that as a moderator, you have freedom and flexibility to decide who does and does not enter your space, and you're not necessarily beholden to the rules of a government. And here's what I mean by that. When I was studying, online communities, some of the ones that I came across that actually did fairly well were ones where moderators had pretty clear and transparent rules up front about what they would and would not tolerate. There was no illusion or attempt at perfect inclusivity. There was just a really clear definition of what behavior would get you shown the door in this particular space. And if you got shown the door, there was no obligation necessarily to try and bring you back in unless you demonstrated good faith. That's not something a government can inherently afford to do, right? That's much more challenging. But I think when you're thinking about being successful as a moderator, especially in this era of, fragmented dialogue, you can set your own rules about who gets to participate in your conversation, and that's actually quite powerful. And some of the ways in which you might set those rules, they don't have to be things that everybody loves, and in fact, they're not going to be. I don't think they can be. And a lot of the moderators I knew who were very experienced, who had been running communities for a long time, they understood that really well, and they used that ability and that power effectively.
I could not agree more on having rules and setting norms. I think there was initially there are two conflicting things that sometimes clash, and both come with good intentions. One is having rules and setting norms and enforcing them, and the other one being very open-minded as to making sure to be as inclusive as possible. And these two things sometimes clash, at least in theory. And one of the things that I've been looking to in this to help me overcome this, and not a fully formed thought yet, is really to go from a lot of the initial research was really around persona research. We serve a certain demographic or a certain group of people. And I'll give you an example. I worked on one news operation that served students in Iran, or another one that served women in Kyrgyzstan, a very challenging market sometimes. And you would think, oh, this is how we define the community demographically. And there is a lot of promise and looking at it differently in terms of needs and jobs that this community does for people. So you might have shared interests that transcend certain demographics, and you might have certain issues, but then you'd have to articulate what this is about and really navigate and steer the conversation around certain needs. And that is something that I feel like many news organizations are really struggling still with, to be about not everything, but really about meeting specific information needs, and then having conversations around the experiences and expertise on this specific information need that people have, rather than kind of general news.
Yeah. I think that's, I mean, yeah, that totally makes sense based on also what I've seen. And I think, I mean, to kind of bring all of that kind of back, and also, by the way, Ness, thank you for your amazing points. I agree, for what it's worth, Patrick, you're that tension between like wanting to create norms and wanting to create inclusivity is like a huge part of what ties moderation together, as well as governance, in many forms. But kind of what we're beholden to can change, and who we're beholden to can change, and that kind of affects, and I think like there are good and bad sides. Like you can assume a government that acts potentially in good faith. You also have plenty of examples of governments that, as you've pointed out, really, really do not, or manipulating the public sphere or limiting it. I mean, I certainly can think of examples too from my own past journalistic work, where governments would restrict internet access, or do other things similar to your example about the troll farm, which is, I mean, wow. That are really difficult and challenging. And that's just, again, people doing this. This is before we get into the challenges of new technology and how it's manipulating truth in online spaces. So yeah, I mean, I think all of these things affect kind of how we think about not only just what truth is in online communities, but who gets to decide who sets those norms, and what truths we agree on fundamentally to participate,
I've always the word truth it kind of presumes certain aspects that need to be discussed and agreed upon first, which is what are we talking about? Why are we talking about this? And where are people coming from? And I feel like there's great opportunity in kind of shifting the focus from is this true? Yes, no, kind of a binary choice, to how are you perceiving this situation? And that's when a conversation becomes really, really interesting. The challenge is that for us journalists really is that we have never learned I speak for myself, I've never learned these skills that community moderators have acquired, and there's this huge need to bring these skills to the journalism world, so that we can see ourselves really as conveners and enablers, and look at that debate that is happening and think very strategic about who is not being heard, who is, rather than being kind of these oracles of truth, because that is just not the case.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. When I was doing the earlier research that predated my book and interviewing those moderators at news organizations, I felt like that was one of the things they did really well that was actually really bringing them into tension with their employers sometimes, is they were in this tough position where, they wanted to further meaningful discussion, but they wanted to do it in a way that really brought in external voices. And, a lot of journalistic values, not universally, but within the sphere of particularly, certain kinds of professionalized journalism at large organizations, relies on this idea that there's one version of truth put forward by news organizations, and it is not inherently a collaborative one. And I think that's a cultural norm that's been changing. Like over the past 10, 15 years, I've seen so much change in that area. I've seen that acknowledged with things like the Pulitzer Prizes, acknowledging community-centered organizations, all that this year. It's been a changed attitude, but it's still in that process of change.
And in many ways, there's so much to regain or earn, maybe not even re-earn, but really earn, in terms of the journalists, reporters, our right to speak to people. there's been a huge problem in terms of like, it's also deeply problematic of how journalism at large has used its role in kind of in mainstream so political establishment to perpetuate that rather than to serve the public debate and serve people's information needs. And I'm curious as to if you see anywhere if you see a news organization or anyone that you feel like, wow, they're getting it and they're really navigating community effectively as a place where we can all learn from.
Well, I mean, one organization that recently, of course, won, speaking of the Pulitzers, won a lot of attention, but that has been doing really great work in the space for a while in the United States is City Bureau. Really thinking about journalism as a civic project that involves, members of a larger community coming together to share information. So yeah, I think that's that's one example. Ness had mentioned earlier in the chat the idea of Al Jazeera as the stream, which I haven't participated or looked at that in a while, but I remember seeing it as a really positive example. So I think there are different ways to think. In general, I tend to be inspired by projects that welcome participation.
Yeah, I would also love to hear if anyone has always looking for newsrooms to learn from, especially so if you see anything that we should be looking at, especially in the Australian space, I'll be really interested to see. One example that I really like in Europe is Correctiv in Germany, and they have they do a lot of crowdsourced reporting and actually have built a CRM for newsrooms that allows them to really create a community around journalism, or I should rather say do journalism building on community and work. And it's really interesting the work that they were able to do in terms of, they started out with reporting on real estate market, for instance, like they had this great series where who owns Hamburg and then various other cities, and people contributed to that, and that was then led to meetings and discussions around real estate, and just had protests with tens of hundreds and thousands of people on the streets when the same newsroom then reported on far right meetings that were really outrageous in Germany. And that's just such an example to me of if you start with community as journalists, that can really lead to much greater impact than kind of just traditional publishing modes. But I'm sorry, there's a question from Ness. What?
Yes, excellent question. What role do you think community managers or moderators can play in the fight against misinformation and disinformation? Well, I will certainly share a thought on this. I guess I can share it a little bit from recent work. One of the big projects that we work on at Hacks Hackers is actually misinformation and disinformation. And so we support people doing fact checking and global information credibility. So there are like a ton of really interesting spaces where I see that operating. One that, and partly what led to like when we were talking about the idea for this panel too, was that I've in certain, when I was earlier in India, as part of Hacks Hackers supporting a misinformation event there. And one of the things that that you'll notice is that people have basically social platforms are hiring journalists to do fact checking and work as fact checkers. And I think that's a really interesting example of like people with journalistic expertise and those skills performing functions that enable and support moderation. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of collaboration. I think that moderators are essential to understanding and preventing the spread of misinformation. And there are a couple key ways I think about it. One, of course, is defining what's acceptable within a community. One great example, we talk about this a lot, I'm a part of 1 million WhatsApp groups. If there's a moderator in a WhatsApp grouping, like, can we ease up on these forwards, or just chiming in and saying, hey, this is unproven? I think that really helps, especially when you're dealing with an environment where things are forwarded a lot and, you don't know where information is necessarily coming from. And I think it's one of the big challenges right now is we don't necessarily know the the origin of a lot of the information that we see online and a lot of the claims. So moderators are really helpful at kind of exerting, I think, that bulwark against just base belief, being able to understand and flag like problematic behavior by like repeated problematic behavior by individuals because they have that awareness of a community's context, being able to negotiate that and say, hey, like person who's forwarded 20 things, like, can we maybe just, you're great, but like let's not do that anymore, and really bringing that human touch. So I think that's really valuable. Yeah, I mean, of course, and then a lot of moderators I know are constantly investigating new tools to also support and moderate their communities. And those can be technology tools too, like things that will flag and say, hey, this claim seems suspicious. Can you pull it aside? So I think like being aware of those tools, also like having clear norms around like what is and is not acceptable, reinforcing those regularly, identifying information that doesn't have clear provenance. I think these are things moderators can do really in online communities to really help, prevent the spread of misinformation that's often socially very harmful. Um,
You just reminded
yeah.
me of another case example in Taiwan, and I don't know if it's still running, but it was a really interesting experiment by a group of journalists that then got overwhelmed with questions. So there's this case of people message each other online or WhatsApp in groups, and there are these posts that your uncle or aunt would send, and it's of dubious veracity. And so you could just forward that message to that group of journalists, and they would then engage in fact checking for you, and they'll come back with it required a huge amount of staffing, but it was a really interesting experiment around an election. And I think to the point on the fact checking by journalists, what is so important is transparency in terms of norms of fact checking, who does the fact checking, and just how it works and how the appeal process works. We've had in some roles with newsrooms really difficult situations when you have, let's say, a major platform employs fact checkers, and they are from Armenia, and they have to fact check information that's coming from Azerbaijan, or fact checkers that come from, what else have we had? Georgia and Russia, Ukraine and Russia. Then you really have these not very obvious kind of black and white truths, but you have these nuances of words that have very strong connotations, maybe in one context, but they don't have it in another. And I'm imagining that there are many other aspects of that. And what I'm missing from the big platforms and the journalists who do the fact-checking work is really far greater transparency and acknowledgement of these nuances that may get lost. And I'm sometimes worried that the platforms are kind of outsourcing that to the journalists and say, oh, we got journalists now. They're fact checking, they're establishing truth, when we've really moved away from like this single source of truth kind of. It in some ways it's going back to the old ways. It's just a different kind of authority determined.
Totally. Well, and I know, so I think we're getting close to time, and we have two questions. So I'm happy we could, one and the other, I'm happy to take Rob's question in the Q&A, and then Patrick, if you want to hop on Charlie Helen's question, that would be awesome. So I will start. Rob asked, what is the best way to deal with commenters who post misinformation or disinformation and complain about bias when those comments are rejected? Rob, great question. The constant problem. I actually think that the solution I saw, this goes back to the point I was making earlier about how as a moderator, you really get to set the rules and you should not feel shy about it. So I think the best solution is to have really clear guidelines, not even just don't post offensive comments. Give examples of the types of comments that are offensive. The more you can point somebody who violates a rule to a clear, rule place where that rule has been laid out and be like, you did this thing that is a violation of this rule. This is not biased. This rule applies to everyone. That can help. But remember that, again, depending on where you're moderating and how, a lot of this is up to you to decide. So you can also say, I mean, I've had people say, depending on the group, this isn't going to work for every group. They'll say, the moderators are volunteers. We're working hard. This isn't a democracy. This is a group for people who like, pots and pans or whatever. And so that's one way. And then I think emotionally too, it feels bad when somebody doesn't like the work you do. I think it's just remembering that you're doing a lot of work. It's very hard. It takes a lot out of you, and responding to every comment or taking it personally when someone feels attacked because you removed their comment, there's only like you're doing the best you can. So yeah, I guess like I would say like define the rule as best you can. Don't feel too guilty about it, and recognize that there's going to be frustration. Okay. And then Patrick, do you want to grab the question
Clickbait?
from Charlie? Yes, which was the clickbait question. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So I one of the great things about what is happening right now about media consumption is what is, so this is a bit of an almost philosophical answer, but is the way newsrooms are measuring success is dramatically changing, because traffic has really dramatically fallen, because we've had that high of algorithmic amplification in the social media age when Facebook, everyone was on Facebook, and people clicked on links. We had the high from search engine optimization when you wanted to be in those 10 links, blue links that Google gave you on a Google search page. And a lot of that has shifted away from clicking on pages and clicking on views, and to get to monetize or to be relevant in the news space. And to me, that is a good thing and a bad thing. And the good thing in a way is that clickbait really is changing, because it's not as institutionally, the institutions that build in the infrastructure around community moderation are no longer incentivized to tolerate it, because the incentive models of the industry at large are changing. The other aspect that I would say is the fragmentation of social media. You have fewer and fewer people on the same space. So the effects of clickbait is really increasingly nicheified. So I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but you see that. So what really now the challenge is, what I'll be worried about really is the bigger models, especially the bigger AI models, say Gemini, Anthropic, OpenAI, where do they get their information? And especially in non-English language information, and information that isn't really, that it relates to smaller communities, because that's kind of the future of clickbait. That's where you can influence media perception, perception of around issues at large. And we're already seeing that. And that's really worrying. So if I think about clickbait, I hope that it's a bit of a 30,000 feet answer, but I think it's no longer the problem we had in 2015, 16, 17. It's changing to a completely different one.
Yeah.